There is a moment, somewhere around the third week of an Icelandic winter, when the darkness stops feeling like night and starts feeling like permanent. The sun doesn't set, it simply never rises. The wind comes off the North Atlantic, not in gusts, but in walls, solid and relentless, carrying ice crystals that strip exposed skin in minutes. The volcanic rock beneath your feet is black and frozen and offers nothing. No shelter, no wood, no mercy. This is the world the first Norse settlers walked into in the 9th century, not as explorers passing through, but as people who had decided, or been forced, to stay. And they had a problem that was not merely uncomfortable. It was lethal. Historians examining early Icelandic settlement records estimate that winter mortality in those first generations was devastating. Entire households erased, not by battle, not by disease, but by simple, indifferent cold. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that finds you in the night when the fire drops low, and the wind finds a gap in whatever you've managed to put between yourself and it. They needed shelter. Real shelter. Walls thick enough to hold heat, a roof solid enough to bear the weight of snow, insulation that could keep a family alive through 4 months of darkness. But there was almost no timber on this island, no oak, no pine, nothing worth calling a building material. What they had was frozen ground, Arctic wind, and a question with no obvious answer. And yet they solved it. So completely, so elegantly, that modern engineers are now reverse engineering their solution and calling it innovation. But to understand what they built, you first have to feel how impossible it seemed. Back in Scandinavia, timber was everywhere. A Norse chieftain could walk into a forest, fell a dozen oaks, and raise a hall within weeks. Wood was so abundant, it was almost invisible. Just part of the world, taken for granted, like air. But Iceland wasn't Scandinavia. Archaeological surveys of early settlement sites confirm what the land itself makes obvious. Usable timber was essentially non-existent. What little birch woodland clung to the hillsides produced trees so small, so twisted by wind, they couldn't bear the weight of a roof beam. There was no oak, no pine, no forest at all, in any meaningful sense. Just grass, rock, and beneath that grass, something the settlers almost overlooked. Peat. Beneath the thin green skin of Iceland's hillsides lay thick deposits of partially decomposed plant matter, dense and compact, waiting. The Norse began cutting it into blocks, each one roughly the size of a loaf of bread, roots still tangled through the top. And they discovered something remarkable. Stacked correctly, these blocks didn't just hold shape. They held heat. The cellular structure of decomposed plant fiber trapped air in thousands of tiny pockets, creating a natural insulating barrier that wood, no matter how thick, simply couldn't match. A turf wall, 1 meter deep, outperformed any timber wall they had ever built back home. So they stacked, course after course, each layer angled slightly inward in a herringbone pattern, so the weight pressed toward the center rather than outward, preventing collapse. Walls rose slowly, 1 block at a time, until they stood nearly 2 meters thick at the base. And something strange happened. The grass on top kept growing. Roots knit the blocks together. The house became the hillside. But they still needed wood for the roof frame, and this is where the story gets extraordinary. Rivers in Siberia, thousands of miles away, carry fallen trees north into the Arctic Ocean every spring. Those logs get locked into sea ice, drift westward across the top of the world, and eventually, when the ice breaks apart off the coast of Iceland and Greenland, the timber drops onto the beaches. The Norse didn't just stumble upon driftwood. They waited for it, watched for it, built legal codes around who owned it when it washed ashore. They were, in effect, building with the Arctic's own delivery system, a supply chain 10,000 miles long, powered by nothing but current and ice, delivering raw material to people who needed it desperately. Every beam was split lengthwise to make 2. Every scrap was saved, recycled, passed down through generations. In a world where you could always cut more turf, wood stood alone as irreplaceable. But the walls were only half the solution. What happened inside was where the real genius lived. At the center of every turf house was a pit dug into the earthen floor, lined with stones, filled with burning peat or driftwood. No fireplace in the modern sense. No chimney. Just an open fire in the middle of the room, and above it, a small hole cut into the roof, a louve, just wide enough to let smoke escape without bleeding too much heat into the sky. Someone had to tend that hole constantly, adjusting it against the wind, coaxing the smoke out while keeping the warmth in. It was a daily negotiation between fire and cold, and getting it wrong meant either choking in smoke or freezing in the dark. But here is where the physics of the turf house become genuinely remarkable. In a wooden building, heat from a fire radiates outward and escapes almost immediately through the walls. Wood is a poor thermal mass. It warms fast and loses heat just as fast. Turf behaves in the opposite way. Those 2-meter thick walls of compressed peat absorb heat slowly throughout the day, storing it deep inside their cellular structure. Then, as the fire burns lower at night and temperatures outside plunge toward -20, the walls begin releasing that stored warmth back into the room steadily, gently, for hours. The house functioned like a battery. It charged during the day and discharged through the night. Excavation reports from Norse sites in Greenland suggest interior temperatures could run 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the air outside, maintained by nothing more than a modest fire and the quiet physics of Earth. The builders understood this instinctively, even without the vocabulary to name it. That's why they also sank the floor. Many turf houses were partially dug into the hillside, so the floor level sat below the surrounding terrain. Below the frost line, the ground holds a relatively stable temperature year-round, not warm, but not freezing either. By embedding the house into this thermal zone, they ensured the floor itself wasn't radiating cold upward into the living space. Wind couldn't scour the walls directly. Snow drifted over the roof and added another layer of insulation rather than stripping heat away. The house didn't face the weather. It hid from it. Inside, the layout reinforced every thermal advantage. Along the walls, builders constructed low benches of wood or stone. These were seats during the day and beds at night. Everyone, family, workers, guests, slept side by side, close to the fire. This wasn't just cultural tradition. It was structural necessity. The architecture physically arranged human bodies in the most heat-efficient configuration possible, clustering warmth where it was needed most. And if that wasn't enough, many households attached a byre, a shelter for cattle or sheep, directly to the main hall, sharing the same roof, separated by only a partition wall. The animal's body heat, constant and passive, bled through that partition all winter long. They didn't heat the barn. They let the barn heat the house. But there is a dimension to all of this that the technical explanation alone cannot capture, and it's the part that tends to get left out. Iceland in winter means 4 months where the sun barely clears the horizon, and some days doesn't rise at all. 4 months of near total darkness, howling wind, and the knowledge that the world outside will kill you if you step into it unprepared. In that context, the fire at the center of the hall wasn't only a heat source. It was the only light. It was the thing you oriented your entire existence around. Psychologists studying Arctic isolation today describe what happens to people deprived of warmth and light over long winters: the cognitive fog, the creeping despair, the fracturing of social bonds. The Norse turf house, without anyone ever articulating it this way, was engineered against all of that. The low ceiling trapped not just heat but sound, breath, and human presence. The proximity enforced by the architecture meant no one was ever truly alone. The fire that kept them from freezing also kept them sane. And here's the part nobody talks about: the house didn't just trap heat. It changed who these people became. When you force people to cluster around a single fire in a low-ceilinged earthen hall for 4 months of darkness, something happens to them beyond mere survival. The hearth became the moral center of Norse life. It was where oaths were sworn, and breaking an oath made at the fire was among the gravest dishonors a person could carry. It was where disputes were brought, where the Godi, the chieftain priest, rendered judgment with the flames as witness. It was where the sagas were told, night after night, The great stories of gods and ancestors and voyages, passed mouth to ear across generations, in that smoky, flickering light. The fire didn't just keep bodies alive. It kept culture alive. And here is something that rarely gets acknowledged about Norse Iceland. The turf house was a great equalizer. In medieval Europe, architecture announced your rank before you ever opened your mouth. Kings lived in stone. Lords lived in timber. Everyone else made do with whatever was left. But in Iceland, the environment erased that hierarchy. You couldn't build a castle when there was no stone to quarry. You couldn't raise a timber manor when there was no forest to fell. So the wealthiest chieftain in the land lived under the same sod roof as the poorest farmer. Status, when it was performed at all, happened inside in the quality of the carvings, the fineness of the imported cloth, the number of people gathered at your hearth. But from the outside, every home looked the same. A grassy mound with a door. Nature, indifferent to human rank, had leveled them all. When Christianity arrived in Iceland around the year 1000, the buildings changed almost nothing. Small turf churches rose using the exact same construction methods as the houses. Same thick walls, same low profile, same earthen roof. The architecture was so deeply functional that no new faith could improve upon it. Only the rituals inside shifted. The fire remained. This convergence on the same solution was not unique to the Norse. Across the Arctic world, cultures that had never made contact with each other arrived at identical answers. The Thule people of Alaska built pit houses from driftwood and whalebone frames covered in turf, some over 3,000 years old, with the same rectangular plans, the same thick earthen walls, the same central fire. Inuit families in Labrador constructed winter houses from mossy sod with wooden frames that archaeologists, at first glance, could mistake for Norse structures. Norse settlers in Scotland's Orkney Islands built turf hall houses stretching over 20 meters, indistinguishable in principle from what stood in Iceland. The physics don't change with culture. Cold is cold. Earth insulates. Fire warms. And every culture that survived the cold came, independently, to the same conclusion: you don't fight the earth. You become part of it. The turf house didn't disappear overnight. It faded slowly, the way most honest things do, replaced not because something better came along in spirit, but because imported timber became cheaper, then concrete cheaper still. And eventually, the old knowledge simply stopped being passed down. By the 20th century, the last working turf farms in Iceland had been converted or abandoned. A few were preserved as museums. Most dissolved back into the hillsides they had come from, quietly, without ceremony, leaving almost no trace. But the principles never died. Today, architects designing earth-sheltered homes, engineers specifying green roofs for urban buildings, passive house designers, minimizing heat loss through thermal mass, all of them are working from the same logic that a Norse farmer worked out with a peat knife and calloused hands 1,000 years ago. The engineers copying Viking houses today aren't being nostalgic. They're being smart, because it turns out the old answers weren't primitive. They were just ahead of their time in the wrong direction. There is one thing worth sitting with as this story ends. We remember the Vikings for their longships, those extraordinary vessels that crossed oceans and rewrote maps. But the most sophisticated thing the Vikings ever built wasn't a longship. It was a pile of dirt with a fire inside, and it kept their children alive. Next time, we'll look at another people, another climate, another impossible problem, and the surprisingly elegant solution they found hiding in plain sight. Because it turns out, the most ingenious shelters in human history almost never looked like much from the outside.